Good morning, students. We've been looking at the chapter of three orders, and also in it, we've been looking at the transformation of European society. We saw that, or rather, we discussed that in the 11th and the 12th century, there was a very conducive environment climatically for the growth of bumper harvest and the crops. So everyone was making money, everyone was prosperous, but by because of the warmer temperatures, of course, in those areas, in those geographies. But by 14th century, they got unlucky, and the European marshland and the areas and the geography, European geography in the European continent again started becoming very, very cold, which led to the failure of in huge amount of crops, and also the fact that for the first time Europe was confronting the problem of plague, because the increased trade also brought about increased trade naturally led to a huge amount of traveling through ships into different corners of the world. And when those ships were coming, or the new goods were coming from those distant lands, they were bringing rats with them, and along with the rats came plague, which killed millions of citizens in Europe. So that is what we saw yesterday. Today we look into the problem of social unrest. So what we now see is that the European society was suddenly grappling with trouble from all the sides. Okay, whether it was natural, whether it was the disease, and now we are talking about the social unrest, that is the problems naturally within the society. The income of lords was thus badly hit because people were gone, there was a disease, the crops had failed, so it was obvious that the income of the manorial class was surely badly hit. It declined as agricultural prices came down and wages of laborers increased. In desperation, they tried to give up the money contracts they had entered into and revive labor services. Essentially, what they are trying to do, trying to tell you, is that systems change with passing times, because we saw in 10th century that the laborers, the peasants, did not have any rights. They just had to live within the campuses. They did not know about the world outside, and so they were completely dependent on the nobility, and under very, very poor living conditions. But we also saw that gradually the towns started coming up, the urbanization started, and many young people started moving outside these manorial states, started settling in those areas. So they started experiencing the world outside, and this was bound to this was bound to broaden their horizons. And now what started happening within these estates was that rather than just an arrangement of whatever you grow, you that was the food item you get in return, and some loose change for your survival. The rights of people went up when, because they started growing more and more crops. Naturally, they also were being now paid properly by the class of nobility. But suddenly, after a period when they were being affected by the failure of crops and the plague, the disease, the nobility now wanted to bring back, rather change the arrangements and bring back the time which existed in the 10th century and the 11th century, where the peasants were completely dependent on the nobility. That is, they just did the labor without expecting anything in return, and the nobility did not have to pay much to the people. But then you have to understand that 300 years had already passed from that arrangement, and now people were in no mood to actually go back to those, again, times of hardship and subjugation. So there was a huge amount of protest. Okay, although these rebellions were ruthlessly crushed, because, students, you remember I had told you one very important thing which nobility had, and something which the new middle class and the new rich class, the new trading class, which was prospering because of its trade around the globe, that they did not have one thing which the nobility had, and that one thing was the control over army. They had their own soldiers, right? And and the nobility, which was which of course they could see that the other segments of population were also making money, and they had started becoming affluent, but nobility held its control over the army very, very strongly. And when the problem erupted, they had their army to take care of this problem, and naturally the rebellion was crushed. And but despite the severe repression, the sheer intensity of peasant opposition ensured that the old feudal relations could not be reimposed, because now the times had changed, as we just said, and there was no going back to those times of 10th century. So political changes. Okay. Political changes. Development in the political sphere paralleled social processes. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European kings strengthened their military and financial power. The powerful new states they created were as significant for Europe as the economic changes that were occurring. Historians have therefore called these kings the new monarchs. Louis XI in France, Maximilian in Austria, Henry VII in England, and Isabel and Ferdinand in Spain were absolutist rulers who started the process of organizing standing armies, a permanent bureaucracy, and national taxation, and in Spain and Portugal began to play a role in Europe's expansion overseas. Now, students, what started happening here was the fact that now uh, they were families. Students, you have to understand that a particular family has been in rule for 2 centuries, 3 centuries, 4 centuries, 5 centuries. Now they have amassed enormous amount of wealth and resources, and now it is obvious, and they have a huge standing army of their own. It is obvious that now they've become ambitious. Now they want to see the world, not just see the world for conducting trade, but also to colonize them, because the traders had given a sufficient amount of information to them about the great world that existed, and the prosperous world that existed outside Europe. And these now European families wanted to have their stake in those countries and those geographies and those continents. And particularly, if you in the coming chapters you would see that Spain and Portugal played a huge amount of role in the colonization of Latin America. Uh, in fact, if you look into the some of the earliest explorers of the naval explorers of the modern history, they all come from Portugal and Spain and England and France. That these are the places they come from, because this was a time when they were actually, this was a time of Christopher Columbus, this was a time of Bougainville, some of the greatest naval explorers of all time, and they had started venturing outside the Mediterranean Sea. Now they had started venturing into Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, all the different parts of the world, because now they wanted to see what was the world that they lived in, and if they could broaden their, because Europe was a small place, right? Europe was a small place. It was not as big as the world that they used to see in Asia or Africa or Americas, for that matter. Europe was comparatively very, very small. Now it was big. Now it was particularly for them at this point in time. It was very small for to accommodate their ambitions. Okay. So the most important reason for the triumph of these monarchies were the social changes which had taken place in the 12th and 13th century. The dissolution of the feudal system of lordship and vassalage and the slow rate of economic growth had given the first opportunity to kings to increase their control over their powerful and not so powerful subjects. The rulers dispensed with the system of feudal levies for their armies and introduced professionally trained infantry equipped with guns and siege artillery, because now it was not just about they were just not maintaining just some few hundred young men to just to maintain that sense of security, but if someone attacks, and then they would, because these were not defensive armies anymore, because now the European family, these families, these rulers had enormous amount of wealth and resources now, so their armies would not be defensive armies anymore. Their armies had gradually started becoming attacking armies. So even if they did not perceive a threat from somewhere, they would still be interested in attacking their opponents and taking away whatever their opponents had, because now their idea was to become more and more prosperous and wealthy and powerful. And by increasing taxes, the monarchs not just got enough revenues to support larger armies, and thus defended and expanded their frontiers and overcame internal resistance to royal authority. Centralization, however, did not occur without resistance from the aristocracy. A common thread running through all types of opposition to the monarchies was the question of taxation. In England, rebellions occurred and were put down in 1497, 1536, 1547, 1549, and 1553. In France, Louis XI had to wage a long struggle against the dukes and the princes. Lesser nobles, however, often members of local assemblies, resisted this royal usurpation of their powers. The religious wars in France in the 16th century were in part a contest between royal privileges and regional liberties. So, essentially, what we are looking at is that the growing ambition of the ruling families of Europe was not at all welcomed by all the segments of the society. There was a great segment and a segment within the European society which did not quite appreciate all this expansionist approach to which gradually they had started, the ruling families had started embracing. They did not like this at all, because now it was always the growth of army, the militarization was that gave an alibi to the ruling families to keep increasing the taxes, because they wanted better armies, expanding. They wanted to expand their military forces, buy more arms, manufacture more arms, better horses, all of that, and naturally all this war and bigger ships for venturing into distant lands. All this costs money, and where would the money come from? Naturally, as from the people, in form of the taxes that were collected. So naturally, the town councillors would never appreciate all of this, because they were never going to be the ultimate beneficiary, because whatever money would be looted and plundered from distant land would ultimately go to the royal families, to the rulers. The normal people and the common people would not be the beneficiaries at all. Thank you.